For 4 generations, these magical tales of Brer Rabbit and his talking animal friends have delighted the hearts of children of all ages and in all parts of the world.
The film catalog of Walter Elias Disney is largely populated with some timeless gems often rooted in fantasy. In fact, many of these stories are inspired by fables, fairy tales, and folklore. Now, if you're at all familiar with how Disney adapts these stories, you should be aware that the studio will often edit the darker elements for something more idealistic. For example, in the original fairy tale, Rapunzel's love interest goes blind after falling from her tower and winds up wandering the wilderness alone. The original Little Mermaid story doesn't exactly end happily ever after. Instead of marrying the prince, she wound up sacrificing herself for him, transforming into sea foam. By contrast, the Disney versions of these stories are often uplifting, family-friendly experiences with a positive message and a more optimistic outcome. This signature style is also quite prevalent in Walt Disney's 1946 live-action animation musical cocktail known as Song of the South. In this video, we'll revisit Disney's most controversial film in order to address one particular misunderstanding. Now, if you missed out on any of our previous segments about this film, I'd encourage you to check them out. And if you'd like to help our channel grow, please drop a like and consider subscribing to Retro Spectrum. Now, when I first experienced Song of the South, I was already quite familiar with a number of elements. I knew several of the songs and was familiar with characters like Brer Fox, Brer Bear, and Brer Rabbit. I knew that the film took place on a southern plantation in Georgia during the Reconstruction era, so after the Civil War. So while viewing the film, I felt comfortable. I understood that it was not meant to be a depiction of slavery. Now, for those of you who might be a little rusty on their American history, here's a brief rundown of Reconstruction. After the Civil War ended in 1865, the Confederate States weren't in all that good of shape. Much of their cities, farmland, and essential infrastructure had been destroyed. What's more, their economy was somewhat decimated after the end of slavery. It was the 13th Amendment to the Constitution that would abolish the practice of slavery here in the United States. 3 years later, the 14th Amendment would grant citizenship to all people born here in the States. Now, millions of formerly enslaved individuals were left to discover how to live out their new lives. The Reconstruction era was a time of hope and hardship. Formerly enslaved people faced a new set of challenges. Many African Americans became sharecroppers, working on land owned by someone else in exchange for a share of the crops they grew. Unfortunately, this system would often find people trapped in poverty, never making quite enough to pay off their debts. In addition, many Southerners resisted change. They often looked for opportunities to restore some of the old ways of the antebellum South through intimidation and even violence. Now, we should also mention that after the 15th Amendment was passed in 1870, black men would gain the right to vote. The large number of formerly enslaved voters meant an opportunity for black politicians to take office in the southern states. It's believed that somewhere around 2,000 black men held public office during Reconstruction, which included 2 senators and 14 members of the House of Representatives. This time period held an incredible amount of promise for African Americans. Unfortunately, the negative response to black political power in the South was violence. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan used terror tactics to prevent African Americans from voting. Additionally, it was not uncommon to encounter propaganda meant to portray Reconstruction as a period of chaos and corruption. Black politicians were also portrayed as illiterate, vulgar, and unworthy of holding office, reinforcing a number of really awful racial stereotypes. Unfortunately, the Compromise of 1877 would end the Reconstruction era. Once federal troops withdrew, the southern states would enact Jim Crow laws meant to roll back the rights of African Americans. By the end of the 19th century, many of the gains made by African American politicians were rolled back, and black politicians were largely driven out of office. So one of the reasons it's so important for us to study history and moments like the Reconstruction era is to help remind us that despite how far we've progressed as a society, there may always be individuals looking to take away our rights and our freedoms. Now, when Disney began production on Song of the South, it would be fair to say that historical accuracy was not a high priority. Again, classic Disney films were meant to entertain and present an idealistic world for moviegoers to engage, and while this worked well for adapting fairy tales, it proved far more problematic when revising history, especially American history. Now, at first glance, Song of the South seems to present itself as a reflection of post-Civil War South, but winds up feeling almost disconnected from the reality of Reconstruction, a reality that many Americans living in the 1940s, and really even today, would have preferred to just ignore. That's not to say that Disney was well equipped to address the dark aspects of American history, like the legacy of slavery, just that giving people a false, sanitized version of such an important period of time comes with its own set of problems.
Now, this here tale didn't happen just yesterday, nor the day before. 'Twas a long time ago, and in them days, everything was mighty satisfactory.
Heck, some critics have even pointed out that Song of the South seems almost nostalgic for the time before Reconstruction.
And if you'll excuse me for saying so, 'twas better all round.
In a letter to the press, Walter White, the executive secretary of the NAACP, had this to say about the film.
In an effort neither to offend audiences of the North or the South, the production helps to perpetuate a dangerously glorified picture of slavery.
Now, hold on. Disney's Song of the South doesn't take place during slavery, correct? Well, if you get a chance to revisit the film, you might be surprised to discover that it never explicitly acknowledges its timeline. In fact, Maurice Ramph, who worked on the original script, recalled,
Disney didn't make it clear that the final film wasn't about slavery and that it was set during Reconstruction.
Additionally, in Raph's version of the script, Johnny's grandmother would not have been living in a grand white mansion on a southern plantation. Instead, they'd have been poverty-stricken, just like most of the South during that time. Unfortunately, after Maurice Raph departed the film, many of the changes were left on the cutting room floor. Rewatching Song of the South may give us an opportunity to recognize the somewhat ambiguous nature of the film's timeline.
Once again, see all the fun with Uncle Remus.
How do you do?
Fine, how are you?
And his refreshing, timeless fables about critters.
And gave the people outside the South their first knowledge of these beloved animal legends told on the plantations by the old Negro storytellers who had been handing them down from generation to generation.
It's also interesting to consider that perhaps had Disney clearly addressed that the film took place during the Reconstruction era, like at some point during the actual movie, would it have been as notorious as it is today? I also found it interesting that before he was hired to work on the film, Maurice Raph did have one piece of advice for Walt. He told him that the studio shouldn't bother making the film at all. But that was his opinion. Now I'd like to hear from our viewers. Were you at all confused about the film's timeline? Also, were you aware there was such a large number of black politicians during the Reconstruction era? We absolutely love hearing your thoughts, as long as you can keep things civil in the comments section below. If you'd like to learn more about this topic, be sure to check out some of the sources I've dropped in the description of this video. You should also explore some of our other videos when you get a moment. Thanks so much for watching.